So when I'm putting together a PowerPoint for presenting information, I like to start off with a quote. So I like to start off with a quote from somebody brainy. In this case, Albert Einstein did not say this. But you'll find information like this in memes and other graphics on the internet out there all the time. So let me start off with a warning that you've probably all heard before: do not believe everything you see on the internet. Instead, I'm going to start off with a real quote to do with fake news. In this case, someone who perhaps claimed to have coined the term fake news in the first place, somebody very famous. Our president, who claimed that he invented or came up with the term fake news. Now, you might debate whether that is true or not, but he certainly has caused it to become more prevalent in recent years. In fact, just this year, he's mentioned fake news 153 times, mostly on Twitter, but in interviews and other things as well, speeches and so forth. So fake news is a big issue in our society, going all the way to the top of our governmental structure. So let's start off by getting a definition of it. So when we're talking about fake news, we're talking about deliberate misinformation. So deliberate misinformation spread in traditional print media, broadcast via news media, so TV or radio, or online, so blogs, social media, for political, financial, or other gain. It's written with the specific intent to mislead, rather to be humorous. So we're not talking about a parody or a satire. We're talking about there's a deliberate intent behind it. But sometimes fake news is used for other things as well. So you might see fake news applied to lies, misinformation, or opinion that is reported without being challenged. So it doesn't necessarily have to apply to the person spreading the misinformation, but also to the media that is distributing it. It might also apply to a well-intentioned news article that's later corrected or retracted. And sometimes you just see it as a way to dismiss news that someone doesn't like, or an organization doesn't like. So that's where we see fake news, how it applies to our society and how it's being used at the moment. Now, before I start going further into my PowerPoint, I want to confess something to all of you, that this is me. That if I'm talking with someone on the internet and they're saying something is wrong, I feel like I want to correct them. I feel like I have some facts or other things to inform them. I want to discuss it until they can see my side of it. But I keep coming up against a problem. Sometimes, even if the facts or the information appear to be on your side of an argument, some people still dismiss science. So why do some people dismiss science? Or I call this, why isn't the data enough? Why are there people who are still anti-vaccinations? Why are there people who don't believe in human-caused climate change? Why are there people who don't accept the theory of evolution? Why, when we're debating or teaching, is the presented science still sometimes dismissed? So here's my list of some of the psychological phenomena that might be affecting this. Confirmation bias and priming, powerlessness and frustration, cognitive dissonance and motivated reasoning, the backfire effect, and then finally the internet echo chamber. And I'll go through what each of these means. The first one, confirmation bias and priming. So when you think a certain way about something, or when any of us thinks a certain way about something, we like to get evidence that supports our beliefs. And it's human nature, when we believe a certain way about something, when we go out and look for evidence, we look for evidence that supports our beliefs. It's a lot more difficult for us to go out and look for something that does not support our beliefs, that refutes our thinking. So confirmation bias is that kind of inherent human trait when we're looking for evidence for something we believe in. We look for something that supports that. We don't look for evidence that might refute it. And then secondly, there's an aspect called priming. When you first hear an argument or a way of thinking, and this occurs often when you're young, that will tend to bias the direction that your thinking will go in from that point. It's not a 100% guarantee, but it can certainly bias your way. The first time you hear someone explain a certain side of an argument, that tends to point you in that direction. Powerlessness and frustration. Rather than a function of a distinct political viewpoint or leaning, research into belief in one of the more notorious types of fake news, conspiracy theories, has shown that it's not political beliefs that govern whether people believe in fake news, but it's other aspects of their personality traits and their makeup. 3 main points come from those studies, which are a perceived lack of control or power, mistrust of powerful groups or authority, and frustration with the status quo. And another unfortunate thing about conspiracy theories is that exposure to conspiracy theories also make people more inclined to disengage from political discourse, to become more disillusioned, to have increased feelings of helplessness and uncertainty, which ties again into that, feeling of powerlessness and frustration. The idea that if big government's controlling anything, what can I do as a single person? Cognitive dissonance and motivated reasoning. When we are presented with something that challenges how we think about something or how what we believe in, it creates an uncomfortable mental feeling. We want to resolve it somehow. We don't want to be stuck with an uncomfortable mental feeling. So if we think about the way the world works and someone comes along and says, well, actually, the evidence shows this, we're kind of stuck with that issue. Now, no offense to anyone here who works on the college's strategic plan. This is just a cartoon. But it was a nice illustration of that if someone says, well, I've come up with a strategic plan, and if your numbers are correct, my plan is irrational, that then creates cognitive dissonance. You have to resolve that somehow. So there's 2 ways you can resolve the cognitive dissonance in this case. You can either change your thoughts and beliefs. So in this case, okay, maybe the strategic plan I worked very hard for and I thought was good is irrational. But that's difficult. The mentally easy thing to do, the one that requires less mental energy, is to either avoid it or explain it away. So you might just say, as the cartoon does, wow, you're bad with numbers. That's why the numbers say that. Or it might be to ignore that report, or it might be to paint that person as a bad person. If they're a bad person, maybe their arguments aren't as powerful. So there are ways we want to resolve that, and it's easier for us to make the challenging information go away than it is to take in that challenging information and go, well, okay, that person's really making me think. Maybe there is something to that point. I might have to change something about myself. And sometimes, I don't know, how many people here have argued with someone on the internet before about something? I was going to say you're going to have. You might find sometimes, no matter how strong your argument is, the reasoning that counteracts that just keeps getting more convoluted and complicated in order for that person to continue to uphold their point of view. And in that case, that's what's called motivated reasoning. When someone really reasons beyond what you'd consider maybe logical or sound thinking, but just continues to reason and reason and reason, just so they can keep their thoughts or beliefs intact. That's what's called motivated reasoning. It's not reasoning by logic, it's reasoning by, I want to keep my belief intact, my thoughts intact. And then one of the weirdest psychological phenomena, is something called the backfire effect. That sometimes when you present evidence, and we're talking, facts, hard data to someone, that is contrary to their beliefs, sometimes you might end up making that belief stronger. So you present evidence that contradicts their belief, and after you've done that, they end up feeling more strongly about their belief instead of less strongly. And that is because part of our brain that responds to threats, when examined in an fMRI scan, the amygdala, one of the parts of the brain that governs emotions, ends up responding to intellectual challenges in the same way it does to physical threats in our environment. So, and by the way, the oatmeal is hilarious. Please go on there and have a look at the particular cartoon about the backfire effect. It's fantastic. So our brain responds to intellectual threats the same way it does to physical threats. So what that means is when we have very, very strong beliefs or thoughts that maybe we've carried or built together from childhood, they end up becoming, in a sense, who we are, and are very, very sensitive to threats or challenges. And because of this, sometimes when our core beliefs are under attack, we tend towards mentally strengthening those core beliefs for the next time we're under attack. So our brain responds to a new concept by feeling under attack, and then afterwards strengthens those opinions further. And then finally we have the internet echo chamber. So online it's easy to avoid challenging information. So for example on Facebook, you can choose who you follow. You can choose who you see in your feed. If you have people whose opinions you don't like or don't want to see, you can get rid of them fairly easily. You can unsubscribe, you can ignore, you can unfollow, you can block, you can do all these kinds of things. So you can customize a lot of what you see on the internet to only support what you believe. It's going to make your brain feel better, it's going to make your brain feel less under attack, you're going to experience less cognitive dissonance, but is that really a good thing? Another problem is fake and real news is presented in the same fashion. So just from my Facebook feed a few days ago, you can have news organizations being presented along with very dubious sources and being presented in a similar fashion. Fake and real news is often distributed in equal fashion, so in equal amounts. And then finally, there's another unfortunate aspect of our cognitive makeup is something called the illusory truth effect. So let's say you know the truth about a certain issue, but then through media or your friends or from social media, you hear an item of fake news over and over and over and over and over again, which contradicts what you know is correct. And you keep hearing that over and over and over and over and over again. Later on, when you try and remember that issue, you're more likely to recall the lie than the truth you originally knew. The more something is repeated, even if you originally knew it wasn't correct, you'll eventually start remembering as the correct version of it, as the more truthful version. So, having gone through all that, the summary is, our brains seem to be wired to avoid challenges to our core beliefs. Sometimes our core beliefs, challenging our core beliefs with hard fact, make them stronger. And then the internet and other media makes these things worse by uncritically and repeatedly exposing us to fake news and allowing us just to bathe in a sea of only like-minded opinions. So that's kind of depressing, right? How do we do something about this? How do we get out of this? So, when we're teaching, how do we reach out to students who may be challenged by those facts, maybe experiencing these same responses to the data that's provided? So what I attempt to do in my psychology class is make students they're all susceptible to fake news and biases. Empower students through critical thinking to identify good news sources, bad science, and through those be able to identify fake news. Emphasize practical advantages these skills will provide them in their personal and professional lives, and then engage students in the process of research. So instead of being a, kind of like you were saying at the beginning, Walter, instead of standing at the front and saying, these are the facts, to say, okay, let's, if you don't accept something, or you don't agree with it, or you just want to question it, go out there and find the data, and work with it, and see if you come to the same results. How to demonstrate to students they have awareness, they experience bias and priming themselves. I have something called the rule in my head exercise. So in this class I would say, okay, I have a rule in my head. I'm a very simple person, so the rule is not going to be complicated. And I will give out a sheet that looks like this, and I will say, in groups or individually, you have to figure out what the rule in my head is. As a group, you can test it by giving me 3 numbers. I will tell you if those 3 numbers fit the rule in my head or they don't. Then you guys figure out from that what the rule is in my head and how sure you are. And I'll give you the first one. I'll give you the first series of numbers, 2, 4, 6. Does that fit my rule? Yes, it gets a smiley face. If it didn't fit my rule, it would get a frowny face. Then write down the rule that's in my head and tell me how sure you are. And you can keep testing it as long as you like until you're 100% sure you've guessed my rule. So what might be another series of numbers to test the rule on? Yeah?
1, 2, 3.
1, 2, 3. Okay. Anyone else? Anyone else have any numbers they want to try out?
8, 10, 12.
8, 10, 12. Okay. So what tends to happen in this exercise is that students will test things like 2, 4, 6 or 8, 10, 12. And what they'll do is they'll keep testing like that. They might do 24, 26. Sometimes they'll do things that make me think, like they'll do -5, -3, -1. And eventually, all the groups will end up somewhat sure that they've got a rule that's either multiples of 2 or increasing by 2. And what will tend to happen is, because those first 3 numbers are provided, 2, 4, 6, what does that make you think the rule is going to be? Counting by 2s or multiples of 2. Most people will test based on that thought. I think it's a multiple of 2, or I think it's going up by 2. I'll continue to test that, and every time, and they'll keep testing and testing it and testing it, and decide, yes, that one of those 2 is the correct answer. What will ultimately happen is 90% of the class will not guess the rule correctly, even though they're 100% sure. And the reason for it is, people tend to test what they think is the right rule, and look for evidence only for that, and don't look for sequences that might not fit the rule they first thought of. So about 90% of students, the first time around, will be 100% sure they figured out the rule and not actually get it right. And what is the 2, 4, 6 on the sheet above? What might that be called? I've used it already when I talked about bias right at the beginning. It's priming the students. 2, 4, 6 does fit the rule. The rule is actually just the numbers would increase. So nice job with the 1, 2, 3. But students will be primed by the idea of 2, 4, 6 and just follow that instead. How am I doing on time?
I think this would be a good time to...
Okay. All right. So I will just quickly go through the other stuff. So biases inherently are not bad. Just strive to be aware of them and take steps like the scientific method to challenge or counteract them. Education about primary sources. How do you tell a good source from a bad one? I suggest using the CRAP worksheet, which stands for Currency, Relevance, Authority, Accuracy, and Purpose. It's a good worksheet to go through to really think about the sources you're looking at. Also, I have 2 handouts for the red flags of bad science, which are good at helping students identify good from bad science, or at least raise red flags. And then for practical advantages, someone's going to make you spend your time or your money or your vote on something. How do you determine you're going to make the right decision? Is through learning these concepts. A consequence of a bad decision is this device, which the Iraqi government bought $68 million worth of these bomb detecting devices. All they have inside them is a security tag you might find on clothing. So it might have led to thousands of deaths of innocent Iraqi citizens just because people didn't follow the processes of good science. And for the backfire effect and cognitive dissonance, when you're debating with someone, try and think about working with them and presenting especially controversial topics in a neutral way so that you can limit the immediate emotional reaction to something. Another piece of good news is Google, Twitter, and Facebook are trying to change. They are trying to do their best, but they certainly haven't found a perfect way to do that yet. So finally, through this education, awareness, empowerment, and real-world examples of engagement, we can counteract some of the traits I've identified and limit the proliferation of fake news throughout a society. But it's also reinforcing critical thinking, skepticism, and the scientific method of lifelong skills, which will continue past where you are in college right now and continue on in your real life when you deal with professional or your own real life situations where you have to apply these same methods. And I like to end with just, if you've ever watched the series Cosmos with Neil deGrasse Tyson, I like his 5 simple rules: question authority, think for yourself, question yourself, follow the evidence wherever it leads, and finally, remember you could be wrong about something.